Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And so, this is a catch-up week. Not quite as many albums because I had to drop one at the last minute when I couldn't find all the lyrics. Patrons, keep that in mind before you request albums. But as the third last On the Pulse episode for 2020, this does fill in some notable gaps with albums that my patrons wanted me to cover. Next week I got more actual current releases, so catch-up might be a bit hit and miss depending on my time. But hopefully this might be a quick episode for once, so let's get on the pulse. So we got 6 albums on the docket. Let's start off with, from Dogleg, Miley. Oh, I'm kicking myself that I didn't get to this one earlier. It's been on my radar for a while, because Dogleg, they're a Detroit indie rock / post-hardcore band that released a couple EPs the past few years, but this is their debut album proper, notable for a bit of a nerdy streak that never felt oversold or to the detriment of their wilder, more rambunctious sound. And it's a bit of an odd specimen, I will say that. There's a part of me that wants to place this closer to modern third-wave emo and a lot of the content and raw vocals, but it's got some wilder post-hardcore elements in the composition. Plus, there's something that's very analogous to Pup in how the backing vocals are layered on a few of the hooks. They're so shouty and in your face. And I definitely think there's something kind of punk to the loose, careening feel of the song structures and mixing. A little bit haphazard, landing more glancing blows than direct impact, more hemmed in and locked in and driven by the internal turmoil, struggling for every outlet to burst forth, really release that tension, which kind of makes sense, as the frontman has described a lot of the album was inspired by the tangled whirl of fury, insecurity, fear, and pain that comes with getting cheated on, both his own experience and his mom's, and the sad aftermath of it. In kind of some way, it makes sense that the band named the album after Super Smash Bros. Melee, because there's something to the slightly nervy controls and faster pace of that game compared with the rest of the Smash series that matches the anxious energy of this album effectively. But in the same way that Melee was never quite my favorite of that series, this isn't quite sticking in the same way that other post-hardcore and emo has for me in 2020. Maybe it's how the bass presence is sonically there but never quite drives the song. Maybe it's how the hooks don't quite have the punch they really need yet. Maybe it's the lyrical abstraction that prevents some of the emotions from cutting as deeply as they really could. A lot bottle up, but very few that burst forth completely. And hell, maybe it's the questionable guitar blending opposite some of the cymbals. Or maybe it's just the feeling that Dogleg is still very near the beginnings of their career, and that a little bit more sharpness and polish will come in time to really help them break away from their influences. It's got the feel of a potent debut, but one that has a lot more promise in what's gonna come for me. As such, light 7 out of 10. It's good stuff, but I foresee better on the horizon. Next up, from Zach Bryan, Elisabeth.
Oh, my soul's flooding. Water that's cold as ice to be my muse and not be your eyes.
See, one of the downsides to being one of the few people who covers indie country on YouTube is that if you ignore a specific act who's getting a lot of hype, there's probably a reason. And in my case, it came from a project that dropped last year that got a lot of attention from certain circles that I'm normally in, and given my own personal policy, if I'm not super wowed by an upstart indie country act, I didn't want to step on the hype, which means that while I heard Deanne, I didn't cover it. But then Zach Bryan got a lot more attention for his story and his extremely stripped-back approach to production, balanced out with raw songwriting, and you'd think I'd be all over it given my fondness for Jason Eady. But I don't know, it wasn't clicking. I think some of it might have been a compositional issue. I've said that pure acoustic minimalism can be kind of hit and miss for where it works for me. And while Bryan is a potent writer, I kept coming back to the nagging feeling that this album needed a bit more to truly stick. So now here's a production that's nearly double its length this year, not counting an EP he dropped out of nowhere just last Friday. And I am pleased to say this is a fair bit better, but I still have some reservations. For one, as much as we do get a little bit more backing instrumentation with the occasional touches of more guitars, even some harmonica, drums, keyboards, backing vocals, there's still a very spare album and centering Bryan's very raw delivery, but this time stretched over a solid hour, which I'm confident in saying he probably didn't need, especially as some songs begin to repeat themselves in the back half. And then in cases like Leaving, I'm not sure adding female backing vocals really fit with the song's desperate attempt to save the relationship. And while we're on that subject, it is really hard to ignore the influences of Jason Isbell, Rustin Kelly, maybe even BJ Barham on the delivery and content here. Although Bryan's small town focus on hardscrabble feel of still living in that cycle of family alcoholism and clinging to his fraught marriage in the present rather than the past, that does give it some distinctive character and stakes. But with a little bit more production polish from Deanne, there's more to appreciate from Bryan's nasal drawl and his often very stark storytelling within the self-contained arc of the album that's bookended really well, writing from his wife's point of view to pull him away from his vices on a lover's point of view, the fracturing pain of cold-blooded in the relationship that might be dying, the love story a step away from the brink on Mine, the two-part drug abuse and rehab with an ex on codeine pills and Anita, to the painful confessions of Loom. I mean, shame he dropped the anti-music journalist song Me and Mine on the back half to fit in with the secondary arc of trying to build his career on the road. It just strikes me as kind of unnecessary, especially when the song is more upbeat and developed and really has a lot more going on. But as a whole, you know, it's a damn good listen, albeit a long one, and I see Zach Bryan going places, but he's not quite there yet for me, even if I absolutely hear him getting there eventually. So, very strong 7 out of 10, highly recommended. Give it a chance, check it out. Next up from Soko, Feel Feeling. How do you disappear? So this was an odd experience. I get a request to cover this out of my backlog. I don't recognize the name. Turns out her last album dropped in 2015. It's been a long gap. That's understandable. But then I put on her debut, which is more of a low-key indie pop exercise that feels very early 2010s. And then I hear We Might Be Dead Tomorrow, and suddenly light bulb goes off with a, oh damn, I remember this song, it was beautiful. It was tied to that First Kiss viral video from 2014, and I always thought the video, the slap ripping on it, was way better. Well, turns out she didn't stay in that smoky early territory. She kept some of the Lana Del Rey-esque atmosphere and breathy vocals, but in 2015 she put out an album with some retro tempos and a post-punk scale that actually was pretty good. And now in 2020... well, given the low-key style she embraced back in the early 2010s is kind of in vogue, this is kind of a fusion of both her styles for a more languid listen. And as much as I've struggled a bit to get a feel for this project, partially because the glamorous deflection in its timbres prevents the listeners from getting all that close to the yearning reality of many of these songs, seeking love or trying to parse the way through a series of ugly relationships, most of which Soko is riding in a bisexual, Californicated haze, where even she's not quite sure of what she wants amidst all the contradictions and a slight veneer of irony. I'm not going to deny that there's a certain hazy on weed. It certainly creates the vibe, but I also say it's not one that really grabs me, and it's more coming in the execution. Soko's throatier delivery, while sultry to the point where it's no surprise there is a song in French here, it can get kind of lost in the atmospherics, and that is a problem when I don't think said atmosphere is all that distinct. An album like this owes a lot to Lana Del Rey, but with slightly better grooves but ugly, wheedling guitar tones cribbed from an Ariel Pink album. And while I think Soko is more likable overall, she doesn't really have the same personality in the content or delivery, which is why she shone so strongly against the sparest of production. And when they add on the pitch-corrected and contorted vocals to try and compensate for it, well, it doesn't really help. Again, this might be one that I just think is not for me, and while the vibe gets very sleepy at the end, there is enough sensitive, heartfelt, and emotionally interesting writing to save it from mediocrity, so very light 6 out of 10. One to like it more, but overall kind of indifferent. Not sure how much I'm going to remember it either. Just saying. Next up from Elzhi, 7 times down, 8 times.
Leon speaks, my ink leaks neon in his colorless world, seen in black and white while lacking sight. You ego tripping, I hope you packing light and back tonight.
I am kicking myself. It took me this long to get to the new Elzhi. Yeah, I wasn't really wild about the Jericho Jackson project from 2018, and last year he reissued a bunch of older material that for me was more about catching up on old stories, but there are a few rappers who slipped out of mind given the utter chaos that was his release date this year, especially as I was moving around that time, so I wanted to make an effort to go back and get to this. And honestly, going through it a couple of times, like with Jericho Jackson, I found myself questioning why it didn't grab me more deeply given how great of a technical MC that Elzhi is. As a rapper, he's clever as hell, and over the thick, old-school bass grooves and the fluttery samples from J.R. Swift's that he was going to layer tight, interweaving punchlines pretty much forever. At least we're not getting the mixing issues of his last project. That was a major plus. But none of this is surprising coming from Elzhi, as I've always found the most from where he takes the sheer wordplay to more conceptual storytelling and introspection. That's what I get the most from him. Is what I found most compelling on Lead Poison and what kind of fell short on Jericho Jackson. And here I think he falls somewhere in the middle. From the wistful old love story of Ferndale, that was pretty nice. I liked how he framed the 2-part B-movie double feature where thugged out zombie serves as a harsh allegory for the cycle of violence in the streets. And you can tell that his lane that keeps him away from that, it works for him, even if there's still some real annoyance at being snubbed or overlooked, which tends to be fair and true emotions from MCs like him in comparison with the kids that are shoveling out simpler bangers. But that got me thinking why Elzhi doesn't come to my mind as often as his older peers in a similar lane, and, well, his production's never really been forward-thinking, but I think some of it circles back for as much as he will rip into his competition or those who don't aspire to more, it's rare that he himself will go deeper or take more of an introspective risk, which means that all those punchlines and technical wordplay kind of feels like garnish to a smaller steak. And that doesn't help when he frames himself as a teacher frequently targeting the bars at you, the audience, or really just all comers coming at him, which winds up feeling a fair bit more defensive than it should, especially when the vibe is otherwise so laid back and otherwise approachable, except where he compares himself to a serial killer to end out the album on an oddly dark vibe, which doesn't really fit. But overall, it's solid, but not quite great across the board, and I am convinced that Elzhi can make that great album again because he has in the past. This just isn't it. So, 7 out of 10, if you're curious. Next up, the self-titled album from Sordid Pink.
Driving recklessly fast in your car. No, we don't need no brakes. We've gone too far.
So this is an act whose name I've seen circulating, at least since they changed their name from Destiny Potato, and who I've seen described as a bit more of a pop metal fusion, or more of a transitional act to get into heavier music. And keep in mind, I am not against an act like this, but it did mean I had expectations surrounding the hooks and the broader appeal, and the fact that this group would be facing off against real competition from acts in this lane recently, like Poppy, or especially Rina Sawayama, who nailed that balance more effectively. And thus, well, what here I'm reminded more is a curdle blend of Hailstorm, Icon for Hire, and some twisted touches in the more theatrical delivery, and to nobody's surprise, it's kind of a mess. I mean, I'll give them points for some potent, sinuous grooves in the low end, and just how frontwoman Alexandra Gelmash can really twist her delivery from some sweeter singing to a pretty convincing growl, but those are points I will take away for some truly abysmal drum production. The cymbals sound paper thin, the drum machine integration feels painfully clunky and inconsistent, and as much as the kick drum and the crisp snare try to add some balance, they've got nowhere near the presence that the bass lines have. Now granted, I think the larger point of frustration is trying to pin down what sort of pop metal Sordid Pink wants to actually make. At some points it's kind of reminiscent of pop rock of a decade plus ago, just a little heavier, but at other points it feels like a gimmick to slap on some heaviness opposite a softer guitar rollick that can feel more like an anchor to the song than actually anthemic. And I question question whether or not it's enough to elevate our femme fatale, alternatively either vamping, careening through bad relationships, or just self-destructing as she tries to reconcile her darker impulses, or whether or not she even needs to try that hard, because Drive is the most lightweight and poppy song on the album, and it's probably the most fun I had with it. Outside of that though, it definitely trends towards the angsty side, which might make sense, but doesn't always make the most of the heavier elements or let the hooks really shine through. But you know, for what it is, I can't get too aggrieved, especially when it does end pretty well, so it's still good. Solid 6 out of 10. Interesting fusion, so it's worth a listen. And finally, from Miley Cyrus, Plastic Heart. Okay, look. There's a part of me that's been rooting for Miley since Bangers. Yeah, her artistic identity flails between detached calculation and a lot of raw attempts at feeling that miss way more often than they hit, and her instincts around production are haphazard at best, and there's still a part of me kind of seething that her awful Flaming Lips collaboration saw the light of day and Lipsha never will, but there's enough potent talent and intensity behind Miley that I can believe her as a pop star, even as she flits between retro pastiches and complete disasters that are again very hit and miss. That's why I actually might have had some expectations for this album. Yeah, she's far from the first to do the 80s revival, but Miley looked like she was gonna try to tap into the rougher tone and image that you saw for artists like Heart or Pat Benatar or Blondie, or hey look, Billy Idol's actually featured on the album. Coupled with features from Joan Jett and even from Dua Lipa herself, it set expectations for what Miley Cyrus is gonna try and do here. And here's the thing. By a lot of metrics, this is Miley's best album, but that's because it feels like it's competently assembled and not a sloppily mixed mess that flies off the rails, where it gives Miley an attempt to flex her Bonnie Tyler impersonation to some pretty good effect. But I won't lie, there's a part of me that genuinely misses the Miley Cyrus that would take bigger chances than this, because even for as often as she is missed, there's no song here as good as F You, or shows that same sort of wild creativity. Yes, Nightcrawling with Billy Idol is awesome, but it's more a Billy Idol song with Miley on it than anything else, let's be honest here. I think a big part of this is the production from Louis Bell and Watts and even Mark Ronson, who displayed some of these tendencies back with Queens of the Stone Age in 2017, where most of the album sinks into textures that might have some of that 80s bigness and atmosphere she's aspiring towards, even dipping towards industrial on Gimme What I Want that can't quite match her Black Mirror excursion, but it's got none of the raw edge in the guitar lines that came from hard rock, or the rougher sides of new wave and post-punk that want to inspire her sound. And given the presence of a few country-adjacent cuts like the Caitlin Smith co-write High, she didn't really quite commit to the genre pivot, at least not in the same way that she has in the past, even if I will say that High is a great song. I don't know. It's telling that the EP she put out last year to build into an album like this wound up getting scrapped, which to me says that the label was fed up with fronting a lot of money and just wanted her to crank out something of a hit, which she did do, but the album does feel a bit compromised as a result, even if you can tell that Miley Cyrus tried to pack this to the gills of the content with bitter breakup angst towards Liam Hemsworth, her usual incessant horniness, and the continued desperate desire to have anything feel real to her. That's really been the most overlooked thematic through line of her entire career. Now, I will say the album loses some steam in the final third. Yeah, I include the Joan Jett collab in that, and the closing track that might have made its anti-Trump, anti-slut-shaming sentiments click with some better synth blending, and if we just conveniently forget that Younger Now exists. But you know, I do like that Miley Cyrus is refusing to back down from her sound now, and this hits towards something that's a little bit more authentically realized. So there's a part of me that really wants to call this transitional, but the better description is probably maturing, or at least showing a bit more poise, even if it is kind of compromised as a result. But the good songs here are legit really strong, so light 7 out of 10. Doesn't have the best of her songs, but I do respect consistency and growth, and this is both, so you know what? Check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Again, bit of a slower week. I can't think I said that many things controversial, but hey, leave comments down there below anyway. I'd be happy to hear them. Another thing to say here, again, only a few more episodes of On the Pulse coming. They're primarily going to be catch-ups, so if you guys want to get involved in that, link to my Patreon is right over there, where again, you can actually request albums for my schedule, maybe get involved in my Discord if you're interested. Again, don't feel obligated to at this time. It's tough out there, believe me, I get it. If you want to, though, options available. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.